Good afternoon, good morning. Very nice to be here virtually. This talk is about how you as a software professional can grow your personal design heuristics. And so why do I want to share with you ideas for growing your design heuristics? Long ago, 1990, 30 years ago, I wrote a book on object design when object design was new. And in it, we presented a very simplified design for an automated teller machine, just to illustrate how you would think about dividing responsibilities amongst objects. So several years after our book was published, I got an email from an instructor who was teaching object design using our book at his company. And he gave us great praise for our book, but he felt as a teacher, he was a failure. And you know why? He could not get any of his students to actually absolutely reproduce the exact design that we had produced in our book. So he thought he was a failure. And I was horrified. He asked, what can we do? And I was horrified because in my years of teaching, I had never gotten the same design from any students unless they had cheated. So nothing ever goes by the book. In fact, just to give you a very quick example, this is a recipe and ingredients in a box that I had received as a Christmas gift, a subscription to a service called Blue Apron. And this is the very first ingredients plus recipe that I had received. And I was all excited, and there were all kinds of instructions, and they gave you exactly the ingredients you needed. And so here's actually, I was so excited, I took my first, I took a picture of my very first, and that looks pretty good, doesn't it? But if I had followed all the instructions in the recipe, and I'm not going to go through all of them here, you realize that there are some things that are very precise, like cook for exactly 9 minutes. And some saying, see, if the underlining and blue ones are very important because they said season with salt and pepper. If I had followed their instructions exactly, this would have been inedible. So nothing ever goes back, exactly like you might expect it. So there's no substitute for learning from your own experience and reflection. There's just no substitute. So I'm going to stop my sharing for a moment because I realize that I actually have the wrong version of this talk. And I want to get the best talk ever. So this is this one. So I'm going to start with this one again. Okay. So nothing goes exactly by the book. So I'm going to start sharing again right now. Okay, let's do this. Okay. All right. So here we go. So what's a heuristic? Because we're going to talk about design heuristics. This friendly gentleman who is a retired nuclear physics professor and designed nuclear reactors has a really good definition that I've been inspired by. Because he says a heuristic is anything that helps us in the solution of a problem but we can't really justify it, and it may not always work. So that's what I'm going to use as a definition of a heuristic. We have design heuristics, and we should have a whole bunch of them, but they don't always work. So here's an example, and this was from his book. There were 3 kinds of heuristics, and we're going to talk about those and give examples of each one of those. To solve a particular design problem, or to guide our use of what to do next, what heuristic to apply next. So that's the second kind. And then we also have heuristics that determine our attitude and behavior towards the things and the way we design and work. So, for example, here's some general engineering heuristics that he talks about in this book. I generally try to solve problems by successive approximation, which means if I'm forced to give an answer, I want to do it in the time that I have. So those are 2 heuristics that he mentioned. Always give yourself a chance to retreat. Now, this is actually a good thing for someone who designs nuclear reactors, that we don't want to design ourselves into a situation where we can't back up if something didn't work. And then use feedback to stabilize your design. So these are like general engineering heuristics. There's a lot of wisdom behind these, and I find that a lot of these are very applicable to software design as well. So, but let's get some specific examples, heuristics that solve a particular design problem that we have in software. So if you think about it, patterns, and yes, we're still writing patterns. We just had the patterns conference in mid-October, and we had 23 different papers on patterns. Some of the new patterns are patterns on how to structure data for quantum computing even. That was pretty cool. Anyway, patterns are a nice way to package design heuristics because they give us a context. If they're written well, generally, where does this pattern fit when I'm doing a design? And they also explain what the problem it was trying to solve, not just here's a particular pattern, but what questions about the design is it answering? And it kind of sketches out a solution of what usually works. So here's an ancient book that had an influence in the early 2000s about how to structure enterprise applications. And in this just example, there were 3 patterns that were described there in the book that Martin Fowler wrote. And Martin talked about transaction scripts, where if I'm interacting with a database, I just write to the database and read from the database in scripting code that I don't really worry a whole lot about structuring it or partitioning it. And then the table module pattern, where I use database like active records or things like that. And then a domain model pattern where I create a model of the domain where I have objects that represent business concepts, and I have a database mapping and access the database that way. Now, the heuristics behind these patterns are interesting. Write scripts for simple apps, right? And data, when you just don't care, it's just get it done. A table module pattern, the heuristic for that pattern is really use it when there's complex relational data and there's logic that applies to multiple rows. This is back when relational databases were extremely popular. They're still quite prevalent, although we have other technologies. And then the domain model was create a domain model when there's complex logic and you accept the cost of the database mapping. So those are an example of 3 different ways to approach potentially even the same problem. Now, you might say that heuristics often conflict with each other. And in fact, heuristics do. That's okay. Competing heuristics in our design give us options. There's more than one way to design a system. And each of these heuristics makes sense under certain circumstances. And in patterns, they call those the context and the forces that you're trying to balance as you're making a design choice. So if you don't have the same conditions as the person who identified the pattern and wrote about it, then their specific advice might not be very useful. But there are always options, and we have our own approaches to solving problems too. And our state of the art is constantly progressing. You could ask Martin Fowler, okay, these were interesting, but those are sort of clunky early 2000s ways of structuring systems. What about the new command query response segregation kind of architecture or microservices? What about that? And I would say that's not really fair. If I'm looking at an existing system, it was constructed using the heuristics that the designers and developers thought were appropriate at that time. And, you know, our state of the art advances. Don't judge an older system or the design or the designer who made that older system based on today's heuristics. We know new things and we apply new things. And you, as well, have your own cherished heuristics. If we had time to actually do a workshop, I would actually ask you to write some of your favorite, what I would say, go-to design heuristics. And so as new ones become useful to us, we add them to our collection of design tricks. And no longer useful ones fall out of fashion. And sometimes even useful heuristics fade from memory because we always, in the software world, I think, tend to like to go after new, shiny things. So I'm going to go back into time and just talk about one particular pattern that we might know and love or hate, called the observer pattern from Design Patterns, that was written in 1995. And there's a subject that is observed by potentially subject that's observed by potentially multiple observers that react whenever that subject notifies of a change, and it does this indirectly. All observers have the potential to react in their own specific way to that change in that observed thing. Callbacks is another way of implementing it in more modern architectures, but once you've seen something, a pattern that has been recognized, and this is interesting to realize, it can be recognized elsewhere in nature and in artificial situations like our software. And it may appear to be very different, but it's exactly the same thing. So just be aware of that. So we've all seen observers in using frameworks where there's GUI components. Any React framework has observers and subjects. We might have sensors and observers responding in a design for control of a system. And this is kind of a general pattern, but how do we actually implement and create this thing? So this is where your personal heuristics come in if you're trying to build an observer. You need heuristics to know what's an important event to notify on. And you need heuristics if you're observing, well, heuristics from the subject side. What happens if there's a whole number of observers or a lot of observers and we don't know the number exactly? And then if on the other side, and I've implemented observers in many different languages just to do this, for fun, it's not for fun, but for actual, how do I respond to updates? If I go back and change the state of that subject, I might get myself in a loop. So I have to avoid that change react loops that are hard to break. And there's a lot of heuristics. So the point is, any pattern you have is incomplete, even though it might be a complex heuristic. And the forces that drive you to choose one particular pattern or a particular way of designing it, if you choose to it, are either testable laws, like we have to observe the laws of physics when we're in the speed of light. There might be constraints on how we have to do things, or actually accepted design norms. This is the way we should do logging here. And then there's solutions. They describe the steps to take in a pattern, but they don't tell us all the details. So I want to convince you that your knowledge and your own heuristics have to fill in many, many, many design gaps as you implement a pattern. And that's okay. We are doing this all the time. So heuristics are patterns, and patterns to actually implement using some patterns, we have to use heuristics. We also have heuristics that guide our use of what other heuristic we might want to apply. And that sounds very meta, so I want to give you a very concrete example. And again, this is a design, this is a pattern, set of patterns. It's called, from the book, Object-Oriented Reengineering Patterns. It's actually available online for free. I just recently found out. I should drop that into the chat. And if that book had been titled Software Reengineering Patterns, it would be a bestseller, because it really has good advice, has nothing to do with objects per se, not much, just a few patterns about that. But one of the things that talks about, if I'm trying to re-engineer a system, there's a chapter on my first contact with a legacy system. There's a collection of patterns that loop around, talking with end users and developers, and then looking at the software. Each one of those patterns there is related to what should I do when I first. So you can see there's like 5 patterns there, and they're related. Verify what I hear, but what are the guiding heuristics? The first thing is find out what you can from experts. Don't just trust the system on its own. So that guides you to talk with end users or developers. And the other guiding heuristic is verify information by looking at the system and its documentation, even if it, these days, you know, and one of the patterns I think is kind of funny is like read all the code in 1 hour. Well, if it's a large system, so you'd probably read the highlights and have someone show you what's most important, guided by interesting tests. So anyway, those are guiding heuristics. At Mosaic Works, they have a Kanban board for their product development. It's a small company that I have enjoyed working with. They are from Romania. And anyway, one of the things that they have is guiding heuristics about what to do every day. And they talk about them in their daily stand-up. I'm just gonna, if you're unclear about any requirements, go get clarity. They have as a guiding heuristic that they want to make 1 technical improvement to their product per week. And so if they, you know, comes Thursday, which is today, and they haven't really worked on it, they would put that into the doing, you know, a task into the doing part of their Kanban board and push aside some other work. So these are guiding heuristics that sort of say, hey, let's do this. In fact, what to do next, you could think of on a Kanban board, the criteria for moving from one column to the next are also kind of guiding heuristics. And team heuristics, the third kind is determine our attitude and behavior. And if this is, we're talking about software crafting here, we are full of these kinds of heuristics. So the manifesto for software craftsmanship, you've probably seen this, but it isn't enough to make our software work, but it has to be well crafted, or I prefer saying well designed. And it's not only responding to change, but our behavior says we got to add value. We don't just make changes, but we have to make it valuable to our customer. We just don't do changes because we like to make change. Team working agreements are also guiding behaviors. So for example, this happens to be from Mosaic Works on their daily product Kanban board. Just want to point out a couple of things. Let's have a positive attitude towards each other, that's the bottom right hand, and each client and customer. So sometimes we can get grumpy about our customers, but they want to make sure that that's the working agreement that they have, because that will determine the behavior of how you interact. And encourage your colleague if you feel that he or she needs it. So that's just two. So before we get into a debate, we want to acknowledge the other person's perspective. Now that determines our behavior, and it determines, if we have these working agreements, it determines how we approach design together. So I want to share, just to show that I was thinking about my design values that determine my behavior. And I might change these over time. And the situation may demand that I behave differently, but in general, I value consistency in an implementation over being clever. And I value evidence over speculation. So if I can find ways to measure things or know that customers really want things, then I'm much happier about going. I just like to design for what I know now, and learn and adapt. But I want to have simple designs, but not too simple. And so that's actually where I find my values are slightly different than people I work with. And I expect things to evolve, but just not radically change all the time. So I'm going to share with you some other heuristics. I was inspired by this book on writing ethnographic field notes. And it says, what do you do? You know, how can I observe and hang out with a group of people and see what their heuristics are for design? So I asked the Cucumber folks who do the BDD testing tool to hang out with them, and I did for 6 different times in the summertime for me, which I could get up early in the morning, and it was toward the ends of their day because they're based in the UK and Germany. And I just observed, but I also participated, and I was heuristic hunting and wanted to share with them and just see how they worked. So one of the things that they did for what to do next, and this is, again, this is a heuristics. Heuristics are context dependent, which ones you may choose, is on a day in the late afternoon when there was no urgent problems, they picked the oldest bug to work on first. Now, that heuristic may be great for the end of the day because we're going to knock something off. We feel like we accomplished something. It reduces our bug day count. That might not be the best heuristic to use when a customer is calling you with a very critical problem, but this made sense in that context. The other thing that they did is that they stopped and committed code at a reasonable pause point. And I show you this picture of where I've a place that I hiked in Taiwan, because that's just a beautiful place. And that's where you'd like to stop. When I commit my code, I want to feel calm and everything's beautiful. Now, I have to tell you that pause point was right after we got done climbing a cliff, and you can see that arrow pointing down to me. It's a picture of me, my husband took of me climbing along the side of a cliff for only 500 meters. 500 meters, that's not very long, maybe about 10 minutes, but I was terrified. I wasn't feeling safe. I made it though. Here I am. In fact, there was even a sign there that said, don't pause. Don't stay here quickly. I took that photo myself, but I paused to take that. Probably shouldn't have. But anyway, back to the reasonable pause point. They committed code very frequently because they had this value system of code should be working all the time. And code works and test passes. Maybe some code has been removed successfully. A very tiny refactoring is done. Okay, we can pause and commit, and someone else is going to do, they were doing remote mob programming. Someone else can drive. Someone else can navigate. So if you don't have a situation where it's safe to pause, you won't have this kind of behavior, sort of set of interlocking heuristics going on there. So there's some other heuristics they had for making design progress. So at various times we were working on a new framework, and we were kind of doing an exploratory design and programming at the same time. We'd stop and we'd talk about design puzzles. What's interesting? Here's some things that puzzle me about what we might do here. And it was actually, you know, quite a challenging design problem that we were working on. But so we'd note a bunch of puzzles, and then people would say, oh, let's just solve which one that has the most energy. Let's pick this one about what this means. We had a whole list of puzzles, but we picked one. Note them and solve one at a time. So we're not trying to do everything all at once. So they generally coded small steps, writing tests, writing scaffolding code first, getting the simple thing working and tested. But it was also a heuristic that the team bought into. It was okay to leave code ugly for a while, get it working, then fix it to be closer where you want the design to be. And they would go back and fix it. Just one more heuristic, because I want to say nothing goes exactly by the book. Just to share with you, nothing goes exactly by the book. They had heuristics for who's the driver and who's navigating doing remote programming. And I hope most of you know about mob programming. But one of the things that if you go to the official mob programming website, and they talk about traditional driving and navigating. And the coding done by the driver is simply getting the code into the computer. Maybe you're involved in discussion, but her main job is to translate ideas into code, and the navigator is doing the thinking about where we want to go. Okay, so I observed none of that when they were modding, and they were a very effective mod. So who took the turn at the keyboard? Who was the driver? Sometimes it was the one who had the most to learn. Sometimes it's the one who suggested the design idea. Sometimes it's the one who had the most energy or was enthusiastic. The way they chose who would drive next was very fluid. And when things were flowing well, they didn't commit after 10 minutes, they might go 20 minutes. And the role of driver and navigator were blended too. Sometimes the driver was actually saying, here, I'm going to try this. And the navigators would chip in with comments. I felt like I was often navigating, but I wasn't driving. But anyway, the point is nothing goes exactly by the book. We each have our own style, and to grow as a designer, you need to challenge other people's heuristics and you need to figure out with your team what heuristics work in what context for you. So this may be a silly question to ask, but I just want to show that there's a variety of answers that so-called experts, and I'm not giving you the advice here, I'm just using other people as an example. Maybe this is the wrong question to ask, but this is a question that I know people, when they first start doing microservice architectures, because it's a thing to do, want to ask, well, how big should it be? So I'm going to give you a couple of quotes. Sam Newman, who wrote the first book on it, says small enough and no smaller. Now that's not really a heuristic. That's sort of like, don't make it too tiny because the communications overhead is going to be bad. So back off from doing that. So that's pretty high level, general, vague heuristic. Ben Morris, he's the guy who wrote a blog. I found this. He says, a single deployable service should be no bigger than a bounded context, but no smaller than an aggregate. Now I use those, I bolded those words because those heuristics are based on, here's a range, and they're using domain-driven design concepts. So if you're not familiar with those, then this wouldn't make sense to you. But a bounded context is roughly something where the business processing, we speak the same language and the software treats customers in the same way or treats orders in the same way. It's different, you know, so you have to find where we're coherent with the language that we talk about our designs. Stephen Tilkoff says, well, I'd probably end up with a dozen, maybe 20 or 30, as I prefer, you know, and more importantly, so he's focusing on the heuristic for any given interaction. I'd end up touching maybe 3 to 5 other services. So I'm really worried about the network of communications between them as my guiding. So size is, if I had huge monoliths that talk to only 3 or 5, maybe that'd be okay. I don't know. So anyway, and Udi Dahan, I thought I'd bring this one up because it has single responsibility. And since I embedded in responsibility-driven design, I said, well, there should be only a single service impacted by a change for the definition of its data. So he has big clumpy services just because he doesn't want to bust up and refactor the data. Okay, those are their heuristics. What do I do? You're trying to grow your personal design heuristics. You're getting conflicting advice, which always happens. And I go back to what Billy von Kohn says, you know, we don't have to lock ourselves in. Choose a heuristic from what you take to be the best option at the time you are required to choose. So do you ever have design disagreements? It might be because the set of values and the guiding things that are worrying you or exciting you about the design are different than your teammates. So, so here's some quick tips. Just wanted to go through these and then have time for questions for growing your heuristics. You can write them down and share them with others. So one way to do this, and I guess we do virtual Miro boards right now, is to have a discussion about favorite heuristics or little things that we like to do to make forward progress, to refactor, whatever we're trying to do as we're making progress. So I had this workshop where we read a bunch of heuristics, and one of them, a set of them were actually lazy microservices, which means don't create microservices until you need to. And when there's new functionality, it's easier to do that than not. And then when you're doing it, you can't design for everything, but design for the normal case and then expected exceptions. So don't just design only for the happy path. And expected exceptions, people might debate about them, but that's what they, anyway. Trusted events. So we're in an event sourced kind of system, identifying trusted events, and there's a bunch of trade-offs, modeling mistakes or gotchas. If you like, and I like index cards or physical things, this format I find is interesting because it's a good way to collect a lot of different heuristics with concrete examples, is to use a card and ask a question and give an answer and some examples. And I collected this heuristic when I was working with Matthias for us, who does domain-driven design training and event-sourced implementations. The question I asked, when should I generate a different event? If I'm new to, event-sourced architectures, So if different actors are involved, create a different event, even if the system is in the same state. And then he gave me an example that a car accident reported by a renter is different when than reported by the agent or reported by the car telemetry. Okay. And how many events should you generate? That's another one. Well, if there are different behaviors downstream, then there are multiple events generated. Car returned, maybe we recorded the mileage. We just don't lump them together. So that's a question, answer, and example. But from that, you can harvest into a heuristic and write a sentence or two. Generate different events if different downstream business processes react differently. Now, if you really like this heuristic and you want to polish it up, you can turn it into what I call a heuristic gist. And you could give it a name and summarize the problem and write a solution. And it's starting to look a little bit like a pattern, isn't it? Yeah, I wouldn't do this for everything, but if I really want to polish up some heuristics that, and as my team or develop design guidance for how we're doing a certain part of technology, I would go to this effort, and it can be very interesting way of giving people the why behind what you're doing. If you're interested in more of this, there is a website, I have a link at the end of my talk, where people have been collecting heuristics about domain-driven design. And one of the things, just giving you an example about sort of a non-technical design heuristic, but it's getting forward progress, was this one. I just wanted to show that is add minority wisdom to a decision. So if you're doing event storming, which is a process for modeling the events flowing through a business, this heuristic says, ask if people are disagreeing or not, and add the wisdom to the decision so we can see that everybody's position got mentioned. So it's not just here's what we did, but make sure that the people who slightly disagree get their voices added in. Another thing that I do as I'm designing and programming, and I encourage you to do this too, is to distill what you're doing. And actually writing things down by hand, instead of just typing them up, has a profound difference. You know, so I keep design notebooks around all the time to write what I'm doing, what I'm thinking. Now, if this is my personal journal, I don't always share it with people, but if we're doing work, I might go and record what we've been doing or what I've been thinking about, and just take a few minutes to do that. Not just all the time, but kind of distill what I'm doing and what I'm thinking. And it can have a profound impact on, gee, when I look at my own legacy code that I wrote 2 weeks ago, I know that my heuristics might have been a little wrong at the time. So another thing to do, and I encourage you to look again for, if you're trying to be more intentional, is you might distill what you decide and document design decisions. And Michael Nygaard has written a blog about this. It's actually nearly 10 years old, but it's a good blog. But there's also a GitHub project on decision records. It has some different formats about this, but as you're checking in code or maybe coming in for a release, if you're not just doing continuous deployment, it might be worthwhile. And I think decisions close to the code, like in GitHub project, Git, or whatever you're committing to, you know, if you have it in a markdown and write them, then people can find them and see what you were thinking at the time. So anyway, that's something that you can do. And you can distill what you hear at conferences like this one. Now, you might distill heuristics from what other people are saying. For example, this talk was at Domain-Driven Design Europe a couple of years ago, where Michael was reporting on 5 different approaches for updating or dealing with changing event record schema when supposedly event stores should be immutable if you're being a purist, but nobody was doing it that way. Anyway, you might want to understand the heuristics behind these approaches, and when would I allow events to be versioned, or when would I not like that? Is it okay to do a copy and transform sort of as a background process when I'm updating schema? Certainly security issues. If you're worried about GDPR kind of there's issues about performance, all kinds of things that you need to consider. So the last kind of thing I want to say is notice when you try a new to you heuristic, you're trying something new, or you're drifting away from what you value. You find your team and you're working in a spot that you don't feel very comfortable about it, or you disagree with others. It could be to have a different set of competing values and heuristics. So our values do drive our behavior, our design behavior. There are things that are principles that we accept actually without questioning very much. But the values we have are usually very context dependent. So I don't find it bad that I change my idea about how to improve my design, but I really have to think about which things do I want to stand on more and what things should vary based on the context. And with that, I want to say there's no substitute for learning from direct experience, observation of what you're doing, and reflection. It's hard work. It's like cutting through the forest, which I was working, doing trail clearing a couple of years ago. It's a lot of work, but if you do that personal reflection work, you'll be surprised. So keep your heuristics alive, share and compare them. I want you to think about being more intentional about what you do and what you value, and you expect your heuristics to grow and evolve. And so with that, I'd like to say, thank you very much. There's some things you might want to look at for more detail. Check out the DDD Heuristics website. And if people would like to talk to me about their heuristics and have us do some heuristic hunting together, I would welcome that opportunity. But thank you very much.
Okay, thank you, Rebecca. If you have questions, we can take a few minutes for questions.
I have one question. Hi. Hi,
Rebecca.
Hi, I have one question about what do you think about the system metaphor in order to help the heuristic?
I'm sure I don't understand the question.
How do you think about system metaphor and expert practice?
Oh, a metaphor
yes.
As a heuristic.
Metaphor, yeah, sorry.
Okay, now I understand. Well, I have used that once on a design, and I felt very cool when I found a metaphor for a part of a design that we were working on. It was actually doing adjustable rate mortgages. And we invented the thing about why is it adjust? It's kind of like a little machine that slices off. Anyway, and it made the design simpler, right? It was cool to think of it this way. It's slicing off when an event fired to adjust anyway, it made our design simpler. And many times I've not been able to find a metaphor. I suspect you might have had that problem too, yeah? So metaphor is a good heuristic, but if it doesn't work, there's always competing ways to think about how should I structure my system. So I go back to roles and responsibilities. I have role stereotypes. If I'm doing object technology, I have other ways of thinking about how to make interacting objects, if I'm doing objects, do it without that metaphor. So it's a nice heuristic if it fits, but if there isn't a metaphor, then I will, yes, it's in my toolkit. I've only used it a very limited number of times. How about you? Have you used it?
Yeah, I use this, and sometimes to get an union from the same thing about the problem.
Mm-hmm.
It's the first use. I think that. Okay.
Yeah.
Okay, any other question? I have one.
Okay.
I noticed that you mentioned event storming. I attend some sessions about event storming last year it was in Washington, I think, with Brandolini and Kenny.
Oh, Alberto, the master.
Yes. And I really like the idea of start talking about pure business and then maybe finishing talking about bounded context and microservices scopes. But I didn't do that yet with a team. Do you see this work?
Yes, I do. And I've actually observed people doing event storming that are masters because I want to learn their heuristics. So I've actually invited myself to go along, actually when we could go in person to at Zebia, some consultants there. And they definitely try to do the business related events storming first and not mix up any sort of design thinking. It's purely business things that happen in the business and things they like to do. And the other thing is that they're very skilled at being subtle at guiding people to look at certain things that they notice without, they let chaos happen, and they observe things and they suggest things, and sometimes they say, "Oh, if this isn't what you meant, and they take a sticky and crumple up and throw it down on the floor. They do things to get people to come to talk about it. And if they see someone being separate, not talking, but just writing stuff down, they try to get them to share. So they're very good facilitators. And they do separate out the business from the technical, definitely. And in fact, doing those on the same day would mix them up. I've never seen them do that, but they've said when they first started, so I have seen it work. And it's usually a way of getting people that you want to do some whole new functionality for the business, or something isn't working well, that you just, let's describe the process this way so we all come to a common understanding, and then they do that. So yeah, I've seen it work. It was pretty easy.
Okay.
It takes at least 2 hours to do that.
Yeah, I really like the technique because it's like, it's not a story map, but it has some things related to the story map. But it's the only technique that I know that you can start talking about business and then connect this with a microservice, for example. Not with the same people and not in the same meeting.
Yeah, the next day you could, yeah.
You can do like a traceability between the business and microservice. I really like that about the thing. Thank you. Any other question? Okay, we're done then.
Okay.
Thank you very much, Rebecca.
Yeah. If anybody wants to heuristic hunt and share, help me, I'd be happy to have a conversation and help you, help you mine some of your important heuristics to talk about, because that can be very helpful when you're first starting.
Great.
So anyway,
That's a great
okay.
talk. Thank you.
All right.
Bye.
Bye-bye.
Thank you.